I'm an anthropologist, which means, I'm somebody who, when I do my research, I do it in the field. I go and live in the places where I'm doing research, and for me, that's Russia. So I've been living and working in Russia for about 20 years. And I don't normally research this kind of thing, but I started following, not Pussy Riot specifically, but just the Russian opposition in general for about a year. I generally am sort of trying to pay attention to what's going on in Russia, but something has been going on in the last year that got very interesting, and that was when it was finally announced after much sort of trepidation, is Dmitry Medvedev going to run for re-election as president of Russia, or is Putin going to make a comeback? And I think it was around in August, there was this long walk that Putin and Medvedev took in the woods, and when they came back, it sort of had been decided, right, Dmitry, you're going to step aside, and I'm going to run for president. And that sort of kicked things off in terms of an opposition movement in Russia, because a lot of people, especially admittedly concentrated in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also scattered around the country, just felt like, Putin, and they weren't completely against Putin. As a rule, they said he did a lot for this country, but he served 2 terms, and it's just kind of time for him to step aside, and we kind of wanted Dima Medvedev to run for a second term. And so after that, there were sort of rumblings in Russian society of dissatisfaction with this. And that's actually about the time that the group Pussy Riot came together. So I'm going to come back to that, but I just want you to understand that that group didn't exist until after. That's what motivated them to come together and exist at all. And then I really started paying close attention in December when there was a parliamentary elections in Russia, and so not for president, but just for the parliament. And it was very clear that there were electoral irregularities, and a lot of people were very unhappy about that. And that's when an opposition really began to form in earnest in Russia and began to plan street rallies. And is that something that you guys are aware of, at least? That in Russia in the past 6 months there have been lots of these big street rallies. And I'm actually curious about how that appears to you. I'm kind of guessing that they seem like they're just sort of spontaneous rallies where people turn out on the street. And I think it's important to understand that they're actually very carefully organized. Although the Russian Constitution does guarantee people the right to freedom of assembly, it doesn't guarantee that cities won't regulate how that happens. And so in order to have a street protest in Moscow, you have to go to the city administration and apply for a permit, and the permit gives you very strict parameters in which you can do that. So it has to be on a certain day, at a certain time, let's say from 3 to 5 p.m., and in a certain location. And it might be that you march from point A to point B, and then at point B, there's a stage set up, and there's security gates that people have to go through, and it's also for a very specific number of people. So you might get a permit for, say, 25,000 people. And if you exceed any of those parameters, you can be sort of fined. And it used to be kind of just a slap on the wrist, a very small fine if 30,000 people showed up, or it went a half an hour longer than it should go. And that's one of the things that's been changing in the course of this long protest season, is that there's in particular one deputy in the parliament, in the Duma, the Russian Duma, that's proposing laws to do things like make the punishment for exceeding those parameters much more harsh. So this kind of season of protest began in December with maybe a few thousand people turning out on the street, and Russians in Moscow described their sort of surprise when they said, I just thought I'd wander out and see if anybody else was out there. And they suddenly saw all these other people that kind of felt the way they did, and they thought, wow, this is amazing. And so at the next protest, there would be even more people, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. I think the largest one was well over 100,000. There's always disagreements between the police and the organizers as to exactly how many people showed up. And of course, these things are all being organized through online social media, and Facebook is a major place where that happens. There's a group called For Honest Elections, and they usually are the ones that will set up an event page and send out invitations, and that's how they try to estimate how many people are going to come, So it's all actually, it's very orderly and within these parameters. And there were several of these from December into January. Nobody could believe it that people turned out at like 20 below zero in Moscow, but they did. And meanwhile, there was also, and I guess I should also interject that I was following this mainly on Twitter, which is not something that I normally do, but when I discovered that it was a really good way to get kind of firsthand and very immediate glimpses of what was happening between the tweets coming and the links to various news reports and also to live stream videos. I started to kind of get a bit addicted to it. So I'm either completely plugged into it or completely, depulged from it. But when these protests were on, I tended to be really, really plugged into it. And every now and then I see this tweet about something called Pussy Riot. It's like, what is Pussy Riot? And they were meanwhile doing, so now I can go back and sort of say that they came together in the autumn, as a result of their dissatisfaction with politics in Russia and the electoral system, and the fact that Putin was just going to come back, and obviously, conditions were such that he would win the election, and they were also really dissatisfied that protests always came in such delimited ways, and Pussy Riot specializes in not conforming to those parameters. So their protests are always basically illegal, so they don't get a permit for them. They do it sort of flash mob style, which is still not okay in Russia to just spontaneously have a kind of an action on the street. And they had done several of them, and they were all quite visible, but not a lot, right? They would choose their moments. They did one on Red Square that was they got up on. Has anybody been to Moscow on Red Square? There's the St. Basil's Cathedral, the huge, ornate onion dome church, and right in front of it, there's this kind of raised round platform called the Dublin Atheists, and it used to be where Peter the Great would have people's heads cut off, and they got up on that spot, which is very visible on Red Square, and they were in their usual garb, which is there are these women who wear brightly colored dresses, they're usually mini skirts and have the balaclavas on, and they like to get up and they'll sort of sing whatever song they've got and light up flares and things like that, and sort of wave flags, and really, really grab attention and have very, very provocative, politically provocative lyrics. And that one at Red Square was one of the most well-known ones up until the cathedral. Another was after one of the protests when several of the opposition leaders were arrested. Pussy Riot staged one of these flash mob performances on the roof of a building just across from the prison where the protesters were being held. So they were sort of serenading the protesters and waving at them. So they started getting a bit more well-known as a result of that. And then all of a sudden they staged this protest in the cathedral. Now, did you guys see the video of the protest? How many of you actually saw it? Okay, so some of you, so you haven't all seen it. So you actually should go home right away and go on YouTube and look this up, this performance in the cathedral. And it was, again, one of those things that it just sort of came by on my Twitter feed, and I go to a link to a video and I'm like, oh my God, it was really quite, it was a very shocking performance and obviously offensive in the way they did it. But the context is very important. And I think I'm going to come back to this. I want you to see the flow of how this happened, that they didn't exist until the autumn. They started showing up doing a few kind of flash mob actions. And then it was around, I think it was March when they did this particular performance in the cathedral. And then you sort of didn't hear anything more about them, but the police were looking for them. And one by one, they were arrested. I think the first one was arrested in May, and then finally in June they caught a third one. Two of them were never caught, and they've actually since then left the country. It was announced, the last two members of Pussy Riot that weren't arrested have successfully left the country. And they were in jail for almost 6 months before the trial actually happened. The trial was then in August. But wait, that doesn't seem to, I'm not sure how that adds up time-wise, but anyway, so the trial was in August. I want to go back and talk about, Because the context of why they did this particular action in the cathedral the way they did, because I find it's been really interesting, especially in Ireland, to see how people perceive that, and what was the purpose of it. Do you guys have any sense of what it was they were actually protesting by being in the cathedral?
They were protesting the link between Putin and the head of the church. He said, the head of the Orthodox Church said that Putin was a gift, the rule of Putin was a gift from God.
Okay, that's exactly what it was. So even though they were in a cathedral, it was a very political statement. 2 weeks before they did that was when the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, had made this statement that was reported all over the press that Putin was, when he was president, it was just a miracle what he did for the country, and basically we know that there's no other leader who could possibly lead the country, right? And he didn't go as far as to say, I want all Russian Orthodox believers and all true Russians to vote for him, but he may as well have, right? It was really an endorsement. And there had already been this closeness between Putin and the patriarch, and photographs of them kissing one another, and obviously just really cozy relations between church and state. And I should interject in here that, this is where I have my cheat sheet. Russia does actually have a really good constitution that was made, I think it was finally formalized in 1993, and it clearly articulates separation of church and state. And you can see the sort of Western, I would say mostly American influence of the Constitution, which that could be its own conversation. But Article 14 says the Russian Federation is a secular state. No religion may be established as a state or obligatory one. And Article 14.2 says religious associations shall be separated from the state and shall be equal before the law. So that's really, really clear. And as it turns out, these women in Pussy Riot, I actually see them as these really patriotic Russians who know their constitution really well. They're all sort of in college, or they were before they were arrested, and really understand these issues. And they said, wait a minute, this can't happen. The church and state can't be that cozy. This is something we want to make a statement about. So in their minds, it was very much a political statement to go into the cathedral and get up on, but it's funny because even when I watched it, I thought, whoa, that's pushing it too far for me, and it's really nasty, and I don't particularly like the music, and I think they were a bit naive. They just thought, right, let's go in the cathedral and we'll just sort of sing the song and we'll film it, and then what they did later is they intercut filming in the cathedral with some other footage that they had, and did the soundtrack of the song that they composed. And I think they probably went into in this cathedral, of course, do you guys know anything about the way a Russian Orthodox church is set up inside? I think it's maybe a bit different even than a Catholic church, where there's sort of the main area where people can stand, but then there's a few steps leading up to this raised platform, and then there's a wall that's called the iconostasis it's covered with these gorgeous, amazing icons, and then behind that, hidden, is the actual altar. So you don't actually see the priest when he's doing the most sacred things. It's hidden behind that iconostasis. And I think they looked at that and thought, oh look, a stage. Let's get up on the stage, and then we'll really be seen more clearly. And they performed this song, and it lasted 40 seconds. And I watched the video and timed it. It was all of 40 seconds before they were completely stopped and just chased out of the cathedral. And that was that. They were chased out and they went away. And the song starts with the words, Mother Mary, Virgin Mary, Mother of God, please drive out Putin. And it's really important to understand what they were saying. And then they actually continue with this chorus that's Syan, 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 Gaspodnya, which is holy, holy, holy shit. And I think that's the part that really offended a lot of people. But but they were saying, Mother of God, and they call it a punk prayer. It's called, Punk My Lieben, punk prayer. Mother of God, drive Putin out of the church, because the church is too sacred for that. The church should not be sullying itself with this dirty relationship with the secular world, with Putin, with the state. And by the same token, it shouldn't, the state shouldn't be there. We are, a secular state, and we are Russian voters who don't want the church dictating to us or to anybody who should be voted for. So it was a purely political statement. I promised myself that I would see how long I was talking. Just tell me if you want us to stop.
More.
But just a little bit more of the story, because when it really came out was how absurd everything about this was during the trial, and that completely ruined my summer, because it turned out not only could I follow it on Twitter, but the court itself posted a live video feed on its website. And this is what I find really ironic and amazing in all of the discussion of Russia as this, kind of scary and stern place where people have no freedoms. Oh God, it must be horrible. And it's slipping back into this, horrible Soviet past, which isn't really happening, not quite that way. But you could go into this courtroom with your smartphone or your iPad and walk right in and sit down and proceed to tweet everything that was happening, in the courtroom. They would allow people to take pictures, but they did allow them to have their smartphones, and they had, the video camera set up, and they were broadcasting the whole thing. Now, in an American courthouse, I don't know how it is in Ireland, but you could not get in the building with a smartphone. You would have to check that at the door. So the idea that the court actually was that open, and I mean, that was kind of their mistake, is allowing people, and then having it that open, and then proceeding to have proceedings that were as absurd as they were. But for the first few days, until they had the testimony of the victims, and then they closed the video feed, you could watch it, and listen to all of the testimony. And it really was, even though, and actually I should read what it was that they were actually accused of. There's a section of the Russian Penal Code, it's Article 213, about hooliganism, and there are lots of different circumstances under which you can prosecute for hooliganism, and they chose very specifically hooliganism, that is, gross violation of public order carried out by a group of persons by prior conspiracy, and that was one element that they added that immediately upped the possible sentence to 7 years. So by prior conspiracy expressing a clear disrespect towards society motivated by religious hatred and enmity, and motivated by hatred toward a particular social group. And that social group would be Russian Orthodox believers. And they could have had, hooliganism could have been motivated by lots of other things, but they chose that portion of the penal code to charge them with. And this is where the main crux of the whole trial hinged on that, because the 3 members of Pussy Riot that were arrested, out of the 5 that had been there, and their lawyers consistently argued all along, yeah, okay, fine, they're guilty of hooliganism, but they weren't motivated by religious hatred. This was an expressly political act, and it was expressly targeted as an anti-Putin protest. And they wanted to be able to express that in the courtroom, and they never got the chance. The court proceedings were, it was amazing. They were really skillfully scripted, I would say. There was the judge, who almost never appeared on camera. There's one famous photograph that someone snuck on their iPhone in the courtroom and tweeted it, and it got out everywhere. Other than that, you never saw her. But besides the judge, there was the prosecutor and 3 attorneys that were sort of speaking on behalf of the victims. And they basically had to go out and find victims, and they chose 7 people who were in the cathedral at the moment the Pussy Riot was there. And 3 of them were sort of women that sell candles in the cathedral. 3 of them were, they called them altar boys, although they were men, really. And then 1 was a security guard in the cathedral. So those 5 people sort of set up against the 3 lawyers that were defending the 3 women, who all during the trial were kept in that sort of, we call it the aquarium, this glassed-in box. And they controlled very carefully, I talk about it as controlling the transcript. What was going to be actually recorded by the court recorder, who actually was writing it by hand the whole time. This was an amazing thing to see, that she just was writing as fast as she could by hand. And the judge would not, the defense wanted to make this argument, they're not guilty because they were not motivated by religious hatred. And they wanted to bring all kinds of witnesses to testify about, art, performance art and punk music and political protesting, they had all kinds of experts lined up, and they weren't allowed to call any of those. The defense was only allowed to call 3 witnesses who were just sort of basically character witnesses for the women. But the prosecution was allowed to bring in a whole parade of experts and witnesses and psychologists and who just said amazingly ridiculous things. And people who were in the courtroom and observing it all used consistently, and you could see it, like the tweets were coming simultaneously, and they were using words like, this is surreal, this is absurd, this is like the Spanish Inquisition, this is like, a show trial from the Soviet era. It's like when the famous Russian poet Joseph Brodsky was put on trial and told, I don't know, have you guys heard of Brodsky, the poet? He's like one of the most amazing, famous Russian poets of all time, and the judge in that trial said, well, if you're a poet, you must not be a very good poet. There was all that kind of casting aspersions on these women's character, and basically, and this is what the crux of it is, that they were basically being tried for blasphemy. I mean, that's not what the charge was about. It was about hooliganism that was motivated by religious hatred. But all of the testimony and all of the accusations that poured out on the trial were about basically blasphemy, that they did not comport themselves properly in the cathedral. They were not dressed appropriately. The colors they were wearing were offensive. They, got up on the stage, and I have to step away because if you haven't seen the video, they do like this. And one of the victims said, and actually at one point they did this. They got down and went like that, right? So they said, okay, so they didn't bow down in the proper way, and they showed their rear ends to the altar. And they repeated it, and I think the Twitter feed was hilarious because some of the people watching, they couldn't help but laugh. And at certain points in the trial, the security, the guards, like the bailiffs were running around saying, no laughter, no laughter. You will be removed if you don't smile, But even at the very end, when the judge was reading the sentence, she repeated all of that testimony, and people were just trying so hard not to laugh when she was repeating that, they were showing their rear ends to the altar, and they were not crossing themselves properly, and they kicked their legs up, and like you could see everything, they showed everything. So it was this kind of puritanical hysteria and lots of people said they were almost directly citing, ancient canon law at certain points, so it really felt like a witch trial. And people just couldn't believe it. They said, this really can't, they can't possibly, what are they doing? And the judge herself, Marina Sirova is her name, and she earned the name Marina question withdrawn, Sirova, because every time that the defense would try to pose a question to one of the witnesses or one of the victims, she almost always said, question withdrawn. She wouldn't let them ask. And this is, again, when I talk about the transcript, it seems, after a while I realized that she was trying to control the transcript that would end up as the official record in the court record. And I really don't think the judge and the prosecutor and even the defense lawyers fully appreciated the nature of Twitter, because the defense lawyers themselves were sitting tweeting. And the most bizarre thing is that I would be watching the video, and I would watch them tweet something, and then I would see, oh, there's the tweet that they just did. And at one point, and it was very participatory, at one point I could see that the camera was zooming in on one of the lawyer's notes, and you could read what she was writing. And I tweeted to her, I said, move your purse to hide your notes from the camera. And she moved her purse. This is quite amazing. But I don't think on the prosecuting side they really appreciated the impact that Twitter would have, because every time she ordered that a question be withdrawn from the official transcript, it was transcribed, it was in the Twitter transcript, and that historical transcript is there, And there was one really wonderful news source in Russia called Novaya Gazeta, the new newspaper, and they had a person in there every single day who was not only tweeting, but it was going on a feed on a website. So for each day, you could have an entire running transcript of what was said and what transpired in the courtroom. Okay, so I think you know the rest of the story, that they ultimately were found guilty, of this charge. The prosecutor actually asked, he could have asked for 7 years, he asked for 3 years. Some of the prosecuting attorneys for the victims even said, we think maybe 2 years would be a suspended sentence, and in the end the judge gave them 3 years, and of course they got credit for the 6 months that they already served, and it's now under appeal. You might have heard that Putin, at one point there was some discussion of whether he might be able to offer them a pardon, and the 3 women basically communicated through their lawyer, we don't want anything to do with your pardon, because we would have to then be guilty as charged, and we're not. We were not motivated by religious hatred, and so therefore we are not going to accept, it's like take your pardon and shut up, is basically what they said. Before I want to forget, I want to mention that the 3 of them each were given a chance. This is also quite amazing about the court system. They were given a chance to make these final statements, and each one of the 3 women made a very long and very interesting and very articulate and erudite statement. And those things have been translated, and you can read them, and they're really quite amazing. And they were very clear in their minds about what they were doing and what it meant. So they finally, in the end, got a chance to say that this was about politics. This was about Putin. The latest thing that happened, it's funny because you mentioned this to me on the phone today, and I didn't even realize it. I hadn't seen it yet because I was doing something else and I got unplugged from Twitter. But it turns out that Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the prime minister after having been president, was at a meeting of his party, United Russia, in Penza somewhere, and somebody must have asked him a question about Pussy Riot. So he made this little 3-minute speech where he said, and he didn't exactly, wait a minute. I sort of listened to it really quickly and kind of transcribed what he said, because he didn't actually say, I think they should be released. He said, yes, I want to comment very carefully because I know it's still an appeal, so the sentence hasn't actually been carried out. He said, it was great. He's almost like he's lecturing. He says, first of all, he says, prison is very severe. It's a very severe sentence. It's a punishment. And he repeated that a lot, to emphasize these women have been in prison, right? So they've been punished. So he said, second, so the fact that they already have been punished, he said, I don't think it's very productive to prolong that. I think that like a suspended sentence would be good enough. But then he had to cap that off by saying, but third, and let me speak, from the emotional perspective now. I'm going to use not very parliamentary language, so you'll have to forgive me. But and then he just got his face screwed up. He said, what they did just sickens me. He said, and the hysterics that followed it, I'm just disgusted by that. So he managed to be able to say, well, they probably have suffered enough, but it's like we're not going to forgive what they did. It was still really, really, really horrible. And I decided to go and see what their lawyers, how they were reacting to this. So this is Nikolai Polozov, which is one of the 3 lawyers that are interesting. Mark Fagan is a bit more of a showman type, and Fioletta Volkova is the only woman in the trial, and she's always working very busy. And then Polozov is kind of the more articulate. And actually, he's interesting too because he himself is Orthodox. He's the one who said, I am the defense lawyer. I personally was offended by what they did in the cathedral. My grandfather, and this is true, I looked it up, his grandfather was a close associate of the last patriarch when the Soviet Union began and before the church was kind of repressed. And his grandfather was actually sort of killed, like slightly martyred, I think, in defending that last patriarch. So he has a legitimate claim. His father's buried in the Donskoy Monastery, which is a very famous monastery. One of the things he says, he's quoting Medvedev. He says, I'm sickened about what they did and about all the hysterics around it. And Polozov says, well, we warned you. And they did. They said, don't do this. If you take this thing to trial and you make this public and you put these women in jail who have small children at home, you're going to get hysterics. And they did. They got a huge media frenzy around it. And then the other comment he made I think is really interesting. He says, okay, so there's this possible variation. Putin and Medvedev and Patriarch Kirill have all sort of said that they kind of think maybe these 3 women should be let go. So maybe they can then say, but we have an independent judiciary system. We can't possibly influence them, right? So maybe the women could go to jail, and they can say, well, we actually thought maybe that judgment was too harsh, but see how good our judicial system is? Even we can't influence it. So that's one variation. And okay, I'm gonna stop there, and I think I'd rather just see if you have questions or if I confused you about any of this or whatever. Yeah.